Thank you so much, John. And Joel, thank you for hosting this webinar. We live in very difficult times, as all of you know. I don't have to tell anyone that. Let me just get started. I'll dive right in. First of all, here is the cover of my new book. I hope everyone sees that. I'm very excited about it. I think it's very relevant to what's happening right now. So what is happening? Let me just start with some current events. I just saw today a post about a Marine Corporal Tai Ohu. I believe she's of Vietnamese descent. She's a Marine Corporal who was sexually assaulted by a fellow Marine. When she complained to her officers, she was put in the brig, where she continues to sit. This follows the story, which has gotten a lot of attention, rightfully so, of Vanessa Guillen from Fort Hood, a soldier who apparently has been killed and dismembered by a fellow soldier in the United States. Now, why do I bring up these cases? In large part because you'll often hear in the mainstream press in the United States, on NPR, in the New York Times, they'll say, hey, the U.S. can't leave a place like Afghanistan because the U.S. has to be there to protect the Afghan women, right? Let's face the fact that the U.S. government can't even protect its own soldiers, its own female soldiers and some male soldiers from their own comrades. 1/3, at least 1/3, and that's based on self-reporting. It's probably higher. 1/3 of women in the military report being sexually assaulted by their fellow soldiers. This is a huge problem. And again, if the military can't deal with these issues, if they put people in the brig for complaining about sexual assault, how are they going to protect women in other countries? And in fact, we know they don't. So for example, in Afghanistan, you'll hear people like Scott Simon on NPR wringing his hands. Oh, we can't leave Afghanistan. We'll end up leaving the women to the Taliban and they'll be abused. Look, the Taliban isn't good. Are they cruel to women? Yes, but right now, with American soldiers on the ground there, they've been there for 19 years now, going on 20. Afghanistan is ranked the very worst in the world by the UN for women's rights. The worst. So it begs the question, what is the U.S. doing now to protect women in Afghanistan? What have they done for the last 50 years? The U.S. in 1979 supported the Mujahideen, including one of its leaders, Osama bin Laden, to begin terrorist activities in Afghanistan against the socialist government there, which was protecting women's rights, in order to draw the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. We know this from National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, Ziggy Brzezinski. He admitted that the U.S. supported the Mujahideen not to fight Soviet troops in Afghanistan, but to draw them in. And that's exactly what happened. The U.S. has been supporting these right-wing, anti-feminist jihadists in Afghanistan since 1979. And now we hear that the U.S. can't leave Afghanistan lest women there be left to their own devices. This just doesn't make any sense, right? And I want to read you some passages, if I may, from my book to give you a flavor of it. So one of my chapters, chapter 9, is called The U.S. Military is Not a Feminist Organization. Now, on its face, one may say, well, I didn't think it was a feminist organization. And yet again, we, in many regards, are led to believe that it is. Okay, so here's a portion of that chapter. It is well known that during the U.S. war in Vietnam, for example, rape was, according to the testimony of U.S. soldiers themselves, quote, standard operating procedure, unquote. And men who served and killed in Vietnam were considered by their fellow soldiers to be double veterans if they raped Vietnamese women and girls, all of whom were considered enemies and thus fair targets of rape. And again, quote, comrades, co-members of the same military units are also raped in theaters of combat. A preliminary study of female Vietnam veterans estimated that as many as 29% of the American military women who served in Vietnam were the victims of attempted or completed sexual assaults by their own U.S. military comrades. Now, you may say, well, what about World War II? We were the good guys. The Vietnam War is not anomalous in this regard. Even in the good war, which I put in quotes, World War II, Allied forces, including U.S. forces, engaged in rapes even of Allied nationals. What does that mean? For example, as a Duke Law Journal article explains, rape of French women by American soldiers in World War II was sufficiently pervasive to cause General Eisenhower's headquarters to issue a directive in December 1944 to U.S. Army commanders announcing the general's grave concern and instructing that speedy and appropriate punishments be administered, because apparently rapes increased by 260% after D-Day. And that was because American troops were largely using guns, at gunpoint were raping Allied women, French women in France. Jean Bricmont, in his book Humanitarian Imperialism, says that when you go to war, the result is torture. Inevitably, despite all the rules we have of war that forbid torture, that forbid, targeting civilians, that require civilians to be protected, those who invade other countries end up torturing those people in those countries. I would add to that, and I'm not alone, and many studies support the assertion that also aggressive war means rape. When our soldiers go to war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, they rape. And so this notion that the U.S. is in these countries to protect women is incredible. There's this great book. I'm trying to remember the author now. I cite him in my book. He talks about the U.S. military base complex around the world. David Vine, I think his name is. We have over 800 military bases in the world. At every U.S. military base, over 800 of them, there are always brothels servicing those bases. Our soldiers, in addition to raping their comrades, are abusing women in all these bases. This is well accepted. No one disputes this fact. We talk about Japan's use of Korean comfort women during World War II. Korea continues to complain to this day. Japan has not apologized for that. And that's legitimate. But what about all the comfort women that the U.S. soldiers have used over the years and continue to use? And so this is a big point I try to make in my book. This idea that the U.S. and the West is going around the world and protecting human rights and protecting people from genocide is a fantasy. But it's a fantasy with a purpose. We have convinced ourselves that this is true to justify continued military spending at over $1 trillion a year now, and continued aggressive wars throughout the world. One great example of this is the invasion of Libya in 2011. And why that's such an enigmatic example is that, first of all, from the U.S. side, it was led by Barack Obama and by 3 of his advisors who really pushed for the U.S. participation in the NATO assault on Libya. And that was Samantha Power, Susan Rice, and Hillary Clinton, who pushed him to do this on humanitarian grounds. But we know now, as many of us knew then, that these humanitarian grounds were a lie. There were 3 main lies that justified the NATO assault on Libya. One, the most outrageous one that Hillary Clinton enjoyed promoting, was that Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra to his troops to engage in mass rapes in Libya. Amnesty International would later debunk this claim, said they couldn't find anyone to support it. 2, there was the claim, again, that Hillary, Samantha Power, and Susan Rice pushed that Gaddafi was about to commit genocide in the city of Benghazi. Well, if we look at the internal emails, particularly of the Hillary Clinton team, and again, those are in my book, if I may put that up there, we see the Hillary Clinton team was writing to themselves that by the time the NATO bombing of Libya started, any concerns about human rights problems in Benghazi were over. That the opposition had secured Benghazi. It was not at risk. The third and the worst lie of all was that black mercenaries were being used by Muammar Gaddafi to carry out his war against his own people. Now, some human rights groups like Amnesty International initially supported this claim, though Amnesty International would later, but too late, debunk this claim. What they would end up saying is, no, those weren't mercenaries. Those were guest workers from sub-Saharan Africa, right? And by the way, the media at the time was even saying you could tell who the black mercenaries were by the yellow hard hats they were wearing. Yeah, because they were construction workers. So this lie that not only paves the way for this intervention in Libya, the other thing it did was actually to create a genocide in Libya. Because the jihadists that NATO supported to overthrow Gaddafi would begin to attack anyone with black skin based on these lies. They would depopulate entire cities and towns populated by black Africans. They would kill black Africans, jail them en masse. And to this day, and no one disputes this, there are black sub-Saharan Africans being sold on the streets of Libya as slaves. This is the result of the humanitarian intervention in Libya, which nearly no one in the U.S. opposed. Even Democracy Now! Was a vehicle for supporting that invasion. And to this day, outlets like Democracy Now!, NPR, many others, have refused to recount the facts of that invasion, to be honest of their own role in supporting it, and to do, frankly, a very needed post-mortem of the U.S. role in Libya. And you know, it's that type of thing that really motivated me to write this book. War, imperialist war, is a bipartisan issue in the United States. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, Trump announced he wanted to remove 9,000 troops from Germany, and he wanted to start drawbacking troops in Afghanistan, bringing troops home from Afghanistan. And we know now that Democrats, in particular, worked with Liz Cheney, the wife of Dick Cheney, to pass legislation to prevent Trump from withdrawing those troops. And so we see the Democrats and the liberals actually tacking to the right of Trump on these particular issues. And I think we need to be honest about that and call those things out. Will I vote for Joe Biden in November? Yeah, I probably will. As the, I guess, mildly lesser evil of the two people. But I will do so knowing that we will have to fight Biden every inch to prevent him from continuing these endless wars in the world. Another example is that, Trump had this warmonger named John Bolton, who was his national security advisor. He was so much of a warmonger that Trump got rid of him. He was like, God, the guy, and Trump would joke, God, he'd be happy if I went to war anywhere. And Trump was, pretty right on that. So Bolton then writes this book, telling tales about Trump, which is fine, But Bolton then becomes a hero to many liberals in the U.S., because he was attacking Trump. But he was attacking Trump from the right. He was attacking Trump, for example, saying, hey, by the way, if Trump's reelected, he's going to meet with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Well, by the way, I think that's a good thing. I would like the U.S. president to do that. But because it was Trump who wanted to do that, liberals are saying, oh, he shouldn't do that. It's bad. He's a dictator, all that. So we have to get our principles straight on these issues. We need to be principled anti-imperialists, no matter who's in office. I hope it will be Joe Biden. But if it's Joe Biden, we cannot go to sleep. We have to keep pressuring our government to end these endless wars. Okay, so that's my, those are my remarks in chief. So by the way, I'm on both Facebook Live through my cell phone. I'm also on Zoom through my computer. So it may be hard for me to hear everyone's comments, questions, and I apologize for that in advance. I don't even know how far, what time it is. Do folks have questions, comments, concerns that I might be able to respond to? Okay, and Paul, thank you, Paul. And I'm just for the Facebook Live people, I'm just going to say I'm being asked a question now by Reverend Paul Dordow, who's you're a veteran, right? And a peace activist in Pittsburgh. Go ahead, Paul. Sure, Paul. So Paul asked me, for those who can't hear, Paul asked me, can you give some more examples about these false claims of humanitarian intervention by the U.S.? And by the way, Paul served as a chaplain for the U.S. military in Iraq. Is that correct, Paul? I want to get that right. Great. So there's many examples, but let me, I go back in history a bit in my book with what I believe to be one of the first humanitarian interventions of the West, and that was the so-called humanitarian intervention by King Leopold II of Belgium in the Congo, which began in the late 19th century. So, and you may have been learning a little bit about this because during the current protests, statues of King Leopold have been taken down in Belgium. And the reason that is that King Leopold decided to personally take over the Congo for his own personal gain, to mostly to profit from rubber, the burgeoning rubber industry, and ivory in Congo. But King Leopold, like our modern leaders, was smart enough to know that most countries wouldn't support him taking over an African country just to steal their resources. So he came up with this plan that he would go around, he would send emissaries around the world, including to the U.S., to claim that he was going to Congo to protect the Congolese, in particular from Arab slavers, which did exist at the time. But he wasn't interested in protecting them, but that was his claim. And he was very effective at this. So he convinced many people, many governments, the U.S. being the first government to recognize his interest in Congo, convinced these governments that he was a humanitarian, and even got people to give him money for his humanitarian foray into Congo. Well, what happened is that Leopold himself enslaved millions of Congolese to tap rubber tree plants, to build railroads, to be able to get the rubber from the inner country via rivers to the outside, to get ivory for him. He enslaved millions of Congolese, tortured them. If a Congolese was not, responsive to him and the demands to do work, their hands might be cut off. This is very famous. Their genitals may be cut off. And in the end, as a result of his brutal treatment of the Congolese, it's now accepted that 10 million people in the Congo were killed during his reign. Luckily, the reign ended because of some, honest intellectuals in the West. Very few of them exist now, but at that time, you had people like Mark Twain, for example, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, who caught on to what King Leopold was doing, and they, through pressure and through organization, were able to get the world community to end Leopold's reign in Congo. And I think, and as I argue in my book, what Leopold did in Congo in the name of human rights, the West continues to do throughout the world in the name of human rights, I think in a more sophisticated way, of course. But it's really the same endgame, including, by the way, in the Congo. Many people do not realize that under Bill Clinton, beginning in 1996, the Clinton administration supported the governments of Rwanda and Uganda to invade Congo, again, on the pretext of stopping Hutu genocidaires from Rwanda who had gone into the Congo. But the result was that these forces from Rwanda and Uganda, supported by Clinton, killed 6 million people in Congo, mostly Congolese people. And we find out, and I really detail this in my book, and I rely on very mainstream mining company sources. In the end, many U.S. mining companies got huge, profitable franchises in Congo through this invasion. And the first ones to do that were from Arkansas. And these were companies that were very close to Bill Clinton, who, of course, as we know, is from Hope, Arkansas. And so Clinton, who some people consider to be the first black president, hilariously, he presided over the death of 6 million Congolese in the name of human rights. And yet, that was a complete lie. And so we can go down the line, but this is a very common trope, this idea that the West is going to go and support human rights, prevent genocide, when it's the West and the U.S. that are actually committing genocide. Okay. And I think that, does anyone else have, I could probably take one more question if someone has a question, or we could end it here, whatever. I think sometimes less is more in some of these circumstances. I see my friend John smiling at that. I think it's probably true. Why don't we end it here? I think this is a good place to end it. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Again, this is my book. You can get it anywhere. You can get it on Amazon. You can order it from your local bookstore. I really would be grateful for people to get it. It's a tough time to be, hawking these books. I think there's a good message in here. I think there's a lot to learn. I see my friend Udi, who just came in and thanked me. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. It means really the world to me. We live in very difficult times. We're all, kind of hunkered down with this pandemic, and to be able to commiserate with you means the world. So you've been very patient and very kind, and so I wish you all a good evening, good night, and good luck. Thank you. Thank you.